Hi, everyone. Thanks for being on this edition of Grid Forward Insights. I'm Bryce Yonker, Executive Director of Grid Forward, and today with us we have Mark McGranaghan. Mark is VP of Innovation from Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, as everybody knows them by. He's going to be walking us through the load impacts coming from the COVID-19 response and how it relates to the electric grid. So without further ado, Mark, I'm going to have you take it away.
All right, Bryce, I really appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of the insights and industry interaction that we've been having through the Electric Power Research Institute with utilities from around the world as they deal with this pandemic. So I'll jump right into it here. Since the pandemic kind of got going end of February, beginning of March to now, we've been holding some webcasts with industry participants in the operations area and the planning area of electric utilities to track how they're dealing with the situation. And that's kind of been done in three categories in dealing with the protecting employees and mitigating the impacts of the pandemic in general throughout the world. That's both at the regional and national and international levels, just keeping track of that. Looking in particular how the pandemic is impacting the load and demand of the electric utilities and how we're dealing with that. And particularly from an operational point of view, just keeping electricity going as critical infrastructure as it is for the industry. And basically, it's just an information sharing exercise between the experts and electric utilities with each other. And these have been very informative webcasts and participants. We have summarized about 2 weeks ago, we published a document summarizing what we've learned to date from a distribution operations point of view, both from a control center point of view, from dealing with the health of operators and personnel at the utilities in general, how utilities have managed their field crews during this time, both for normal operations in terms of normal system maintenance and implementing capital plans, as well as during emergencies that have come up. You know, the storms don't stop happening. We had some storms come across the country during this period, and how did utilities deal with that, and what changes they've implemented their practices. So you see a website there at epri.com/COVID-19 as where you can go and keep track of resources that we've put together to provide support in this area. It also has resources on technologies for dealing with control center disinfection and for checking employees' health and a variety of different resources. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. So what are some of the areas that have been important operational impacts for utilities during this period? We're going to look at a slide summarizing demand and load impacts in a moment here, but we've shut significant parts of our economies down, obviously it's had an impact on the load levels. Some residential areas actually increasing, but for the most part, the load impacts have been decreases. And how has that impacted our ability to forecast the load and be ready for the next day and the next hour in terms of system at the bulk system level of our generation resources, and dealing with the impacts of the fact that renewables are still generating at their full levels with wind and solar. So forecasting has been an important area. Voltage management has been a very important area, as we have light load areas during a lot of the periods, and renewable generation going on. So managing the voltage at both the local distribution level and the bulk system level has been a very important operational issue. At the distribution level, some systems that have never experienced reverse power flows due to photovoltaic levels on those systems have started to experience that, and we have to deal with that from an operational point of view. Some people have been dealing with that as a part of normal system operations, so it's not new, but it's new to some systems. And then, of course, dealing with maintenance and response during storms has been very critical. The demand impacts, and this slide kind of moves as you go forward in time, and what it illustrates is that as the restrictions to the economy and to where people are allowed to go and what facilities are allowed to be open and what gatherings are allowed, as the restrictions have become more widespread, the load impacts have become greater, and more areas are in the reduced demand levels, ranging from about 5% up to 25 and even 30% in a few areas, in terms of the demand reduction, the load reduction overall that's occurred due to the economic restrictions in a region. We have started to see a few areas just in the last, we had a call today, and the Italian load is starting to pick back up again a little bit, and as restrictions are being eased in Europe. We saw that in China already, where the restrictions were eased and the load is starting to pick up, but there's definitely some lasting impacts as people come back at a reduced level than they were operating before. So the load impacts has been a very important area, impacting those operational factors that we talked about, dealing with voltage management issues, dealing with the impacts of renewables. In particular, today on the webcast, we talked about the need for flexibility more than ever in terms of the renewable penetration being higher as a percentage of the load than a lot of operators have been used to, and having to have the resources to be able to change generation in both directions to match the load on the system along with the renewable generation that's out there, and also has resulted in more curtailing of renewables than would normally be the case in a number of regions to keep the system from having problems. So very important impacts in the demand area. And of course, from a revenue point of view, this is a big factor for many utilities, and that they'll have to deal with and work with their regulators on how to respond to. So very important demand impacts. The last thing that I wanted to mention, and this is these items are from the publication that I mentioned that we put together from the information sharing from utilities, is what are we going to need to work on in terms of lessons learned from the pandemic, and be able to respond more effectively to emergencies like this in the future. And I'll just highlight 3 of these for now, but you're welcome to get on that website and download the publication and review these in more detail. But definitely from an operations point of view, the ability to operate the system remotely in a decentralized fashion, and in addition to our operating from a control center, we already can do that for a lot of systems at the distribution level. There's NERC regulations that really prevent us from doing that at the bulk system level, but having the capability with communications and cybersecurity and the user interfaces to manage and operate the system remotely is I think, a very important area that we're going to be working on after this. We're going to have a lot of data on the load impacts as a function of type of customer, type of system, aggregating all the way up to bulk system. And there's a lot of opportunity for data analytics on that. We have AMI data, we have data at the distribution level and data at the bulk system level to understand the impacts at a granular level on our load and demand, and be able to incorporate that into future load forecasting tools. So a lot to be learned from this pandemic in terms of how things have changed and how the load and demand levels relate to specific kinds of customers and portions of the system. So I think that's a very important area for the future. And looking forward, and the two pie charts there are from European surveys from DSOs of where things are headed in the future. And it's very clear. I'm sitting here in Dublin, Ireland right now, listening to the discussions at the government level and in the technical level that people are treating this as an opportunity in terms of the investments that will be made to help support the recovery, to have those investments also support our continued decarbonization pathways, our investments in renewables, our investments in energy storage, our investments in efficiency and flexibility at the community and customer level. So figuring out how to prioritize those investments so they benefit both the economy and employment, as well as our path towards decarbonization, is a tremendous opportunity for the industry. And so again, I really appreciate the opportunity to chat. I'll take the slides back to the website where you can download some of the information. And I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you very much.
Mark, thanks for being on. Mark, I said I wasn't going to ask a question, but I can't help myself. Can you go to the slide with the load impacts and let that play through again? I'm going to have two questions for you. So you're there in Europe, and we've all been seeing the global news, and it seems that the restrictions in Europe are starting to maybe become less. I don't see a lot of those flags moving down on your wider restriction access. But what's the trend line for load? Is it looking mostly like the European countries are starting to come back with lighter load impacts at this point?
Well, that's a very good question, Bryce. And I think we had a webcast with the distribution system operators earlier this week that I was on, and they also participated today. And they definitely are, as restrictions are being lifted, up to this point, the loads are still down. And but those restrictions being lifted are still encouraging people to work from home. People are, the virus is still out there. People are very worried about infecting their, the elderly, their parents and everything else. So, and also restaurants and commercial entities are some of the last to really get back into business. So people are not going out, and taking part in some areas, in restaurants and other loads. People are staying home. Here in Ireland, Google and Facebook and Yahoo are all having their employees work from home for the rest of the year. So they're not going to go back to work in Dublin, for the rest of this year, and that significantly impacts the commercial building load. So it's even though restrictions are being lifted, they're being lifted at a very slow rate, and we're going to see the load impacts for some time.
Yeah, and can you click back through the slide one? This will be my last question, I promise. Click back through this slide one more time. Most of our stakeholders are here in the West. I can see Cal ISO has moved a little bit to the left there, with impacts kind of maybe roughly 5%. We're seeing varying degrees of impacts amongst our stakeholders that we've been interacting with here in the West. where would your sense be? We've got still pretty strong restrictions, and places like California, being kind of locked down through July. Neither of us are forecasters, health advisors, but what would your sense be of the trend line and maybe in the West? Do you think that there's likely to be more impact to be felt, that we're kind of settling into the place that it's likely to be for a little while? What would your best estimate be?
Yeah, I think your Cal ISO example is one good one, and that kind of, as they still have restrictions, but the load in the Cal ISO has kind of come back from its highest point of being in the kind of 5 to 10%, close to 10% impact range, to not being as great now. But California in general, Tesla exception, but the industry content of the load in California is not that great, and so industry being shut down is not impacting them as much. Where we do have industry and the impact is greater. That's where we're seeing some of the large numbers. Northern Italy, a great example, industrial part of Italy, the loads were down 25% when industry was shut down, and just starting to come back now as plants are starting to open up again. So I think there's no one answer for all of the West. It depends on the industrial dependence of the load and when industry comes back. Commercial, buildings are going to come back to some load level, even if a lot of people are not working. As some people come back to work and the buildings have to be operating, that load's going to start to come back a little bit. So I think we still are going to see a slow comeback to a level that's still reduced, but not as reduced as much for the rest of this year and next year, before we things really starting to get back to normal levels. Throughout all this, we also have our continued emphasis as a society on electrification of transportation, and electrification of heat. And we have those trends have to get to come back as we get back to business.
Mark, thanks for entertaining the deeper dive ideas. You guys have been a wealth of knowledge for the industry and for us. I know you flashed up a site where people can track details that you guys are publishing. Thanks for being accessible. We will publish this as well on the gridforward.org site. Thanks for being on for the Grid Forward Insights, and we appreciate your time, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Bryce. I really enjoy the Grid Forward discussions. Appreciate it.
Yep. Bye now.
Yeah, bye-bye.